thanks for joining us this evening here at the event. So my name is Omar Hatamli. I'm the program director and for the International Space University Space Studies program. And this evening we're delighted to bring one of the icons in space policy, Dr. John Logsdon. So he's going to give us an interesting talk about John Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and the American space program. Dr. Logsdon is a professor emeritus at George Washington University, Elliott School of International Affairs, where he founded the Long-Term Space Policy Institute. He's also the author of many interesting books like After Apollo, Richard Nixon, the American Space Program, and the award-winning study John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon that he published in 2010. Dr. Logsdon is also a sought-after commentator on space issues, and in 2003 he was a member of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board and formerly was a member of NASA Advisory Council. As a matter of fact, a couple of days ago we had an interview with CNN to talk about the Space Policy Council that was being put together. So he's definitely one of the experts in space policy, and we're very lucky to have him here today. In addition, he's been a member of ISU SSP since 1988. So he's been coming and contributing his knowledge to all the participants year after year. And we're happy to have him here with us this evening. Please welcome Dr. John Logsdon.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. This is a history lecture, and I want to make sure for those that are too young to remember the history, most of the participants, or maybe the people from the city of Cork who don't have the background in the history of the U.S. space program. I hope I can do this in a way that makes sense to you. As Omar said, I was at George Washington University on the active faculty for 38 years, started something called the Space Policy Institute, and I left that position in 2008, so now 9 years ago, and finally had time to do the writing I had been wanting to do all along, and that's produced 2 books. One on John Kennedy and the Race to the Moon, the other on what the decisions that Richard Nixon made on what to do after Apollo. And this talk is based on those 2 books. I'm currently about 55% of the way through the next book, which is Ronald Reagan and the Space Frontier. So 2 years from now, maybe I'll have a talk about 3 presidents in space, but 2 is enough to start out with. John Kennedy, when he became president, that's a long time ago. I remember it. I actually met John Kennedy while he was running for president and was at the speech in the Los Angeles Coliseum where he accepted the nomination when he first used the expression New Frontier. So I realized how old I am. He would have been 100 this year, Kennedy. He, of course, died too young. He came into the White House not knowing much, not having thought much about space, but very quickly decided, because he was forced into a decision, that space was important and that being the leading country, particularly in the Cold War environment of the United States and the Soviet Union competing for world leadership, was important. And so he made the decisions that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Richard Nixon had long involvement in the space program. He was, after all, Dwight Eisenhower's vice president from 52 through 1960 and was involved at the startup of NASA, the reaction to Sputnik. So it was an area that he had a lot of familiarity to. And as you'll see, his attitude towards the space program was very ambivalent, very mixed. But essentially the decisions he made on what to do after Apollo have defined the program that the United States has executed, particularly in human spaceflight. So kind of the central point I want you to leave with tonight is that the decisions made by John Kennedy in the much too brief time he was president, and Richard Nixon in the brief time he was president, maybe not much too brief for those that know American politics, really have defined the U.S. space program that we've executed over more than a half a century. What precipitated Kennedy's interest in space was the fact that the Soviet Union launched the first human into orbit, Yuri Gagarin, April the 12th, 1961. The United States had been beaten by the Soviet Union to launch the first satellite, first mission to the moon, and now the first human going into orbit. It's hard for those of you under 60 probably to remember the Cold War, the imminent threat of nuclear attack. As us in our elementary school, no, not elementary, high school, learned to hide under our desks in case there were nuclear attacks. There was a global competition for political and mainly political, not so much economic leadership. So Kennedy was a person that responded to challenges, and the fact that the Soviet Union had been first to orbit a human, footnote, little note known, Gagarin did not do an orbit. He went all the way around, re-entered, and parachuted back the last 10,000 feet. He didn't land where he took off, which is cheating, but never mind. Kennedy told, in the days following the Gagarin flight, he met with the leadership of NASA, his science advisor, and said then, there's nothing more important than finding a way to become the leader in space. He wrote this one-page memoranda that defined the program, and particularly the part of it that's in the bullet to the right. Find me a space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win. It's a pretty clear set of requirements. Space, dramatic, win. That was the question he asked his vice president to conduct a quick consultation. Again, footnote, you'll notice it says, yeah, you can read that, as chairman of the Space Council. The vice president that day, April the 20th, became the chairman of something called the National Aeronautics and Space Council. Our current president reestablished that Space Council after 23 years when it's been absent last Friday. So we'll see what happens with that. Why the moon? Well, there was a technical reason. The technical reason is that we in the United States had a very good sense of the lifting power of the Russian rocket, which was also the Russian intercontinental ballistic missile. It's now called Soyuz. This a much updated model of the same rocket is still in use. It was called R-7 back then. And we knew how powerful it was and knew that it was not powerful enough to send people to the moon and get them back. That both the United States and the Soviet Union would have to build a big new rocket to do a lunar landing mission. The German emigre engineer, he's the scientist, Wernher von Braun, had come to work for NASA in 1960. He and his rocket team were the best rocket builders in the world. Von Braun was consulted, and he said, "You've got me and the Russians don't. And so if we're going to have a race to build a big rocket, we will win because I'm going to build that rocket." NASA had already set sending humans to the moon as the goal of the human spaceflight program. At that point, it was after 1970. He had examined the practicality of doing that, had even done some cost estimating. So this wasn't made up, overnight in response to Kennedy's question. So technical, the race to the moon was really a rocket building race. And the United States, with the Saturn V moon rocket, won that race. It was a magnificent machine, which of course we threw away. The political rationale, you can read the words. It's men, not merely machines, that capture the imagination of the world. It is the human element, sending people, that has the political impact that Kennedy was looking for. And projects enhancing prestige are part of the battle along the fluid front of the Cold War. Again, the political rhetoric of the time came through. This is why Kennedy made this decision. Kennedy was not a space visionary. He wasn't really interested in space exploration. He was interested in earthbound political competition and using the space program as an instrument of that competition. So his memo went out April the 20th. A memo came back on May the 8th, 3 weeks later, recommending setting the lunar landing as a national goal. And he accepted the recommendation, and 3 weeks later, May the 25th, 1961, went before a joint session of our Congress. One of the things I hope you enjoy of this talk is listening to Kennedy speak. He was a master orator, a really very good communicator, and so you'll see some of that.
The dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
So there it was. Kennedy not only set the goal, he was willing to provide the resources to achieve the goal. It was a warlike mobilization of human and financial resources for a peaceful purpose. Those of you working in the space field now, look at the budget here. Budget went up 89% right after Kennedy's speech, 101% the next year, then 40% more. A massive investment in the facilities we're still using today, particularly at Kennedy Space Center. NASA grew from 17,000 to 29,000 employees, and the contractor workforce quadrupled from 57,000 to 218,000. This was a really big deal. It's the most expensive technological project the United States has ever undertaken. Kennedy started having second thoughts. You'll hear a little later tape recordings of Richard Nixon's conversations. President Nixon was not the first person to record meetings in the White House, actually with Franklin Roosevelt, but Kennedy recorded some of his meetings, and this is a recording of a meeting where NASA head Jim Webb and Kennedy were arguing about what the right goal for the space program. It's a little hard to hear, and it's mumbling at the start, but try to listen.
That it could affect the design of the Apollo. Yeah, the other thing is, I would certainly not favor spending $6 to $7 billion to find out about space.
That's Kennedy.
On the schedule we're doing, I'd spell it out over a 5 or 10 year period. If we could spend it on, why are we spending $7 billion on getting fresh water from salt water when we're spending $7 billion to find out about space? So obviously you wouldn't put it on that priority except for the defense implications. And the second point is the fact that the Soviet Union has made this a test of the system. So that's why we're doing it. So I think we've got to take the view that this is
That's why we're doing it, a test of the system.
We can find out about it, but there's a lot of things we want to find out about. But you see, when you talk about this, it's very hard to draw a line between what I think everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians. Why can't it be tied to preeminence in space, which are your own country? Because by God, we've been telling everybody we're preeminent in space. For 5 years, nobody believes it because they have the booster and the satellite. We know all about the number of.
Interesting to hear the arguments. Apollo went forward. Kennedy's preference would have been to cooperate with the Soviet Union. This is a story most people don't know. Even in his inaugural address, he said, let's go to the moon, let's explore the stars together. When he met Khrushchev 2 weeks after he announced Apollo in Vienna, in the only summit meeting, face-to-face summit they had, he proposed going to the moon together, and Khrushchev said no, the Soviet leader. And then I show this speech, and people say, who? Where did that come from? It was at the United Nations General Assembly. It was no secret.
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon.
What would have happened if Khrushchev had said yes in 1963 and Kennedy had lived? Not a topic you can really answer. The reality, bottom line here, we were racing only ourselves in 1963, and in fact, while Kennedy was alive, the Soviet Union did not have a lunar landing program. We were trying to beat somebody who wasn't racing us. The Soviets, in August of 1964, finally decided that they should try to compete in a lunar landing program, that they didn't provide the funding the way the United States did, and never succeeded. But they built a big moon rocket called the N1. It was launched 4 times and failed 4 times. They built a lunar lander. They trained a cosmonaut to walk on the moon, still alive today, Alexei Leonev. So they were in the race, but not until after Kennedy had been killed. In this period, fall of 1963, Kennedy ordered a major review of all space programs. And there's some question of what he would have done with that review. But he went to see progress at what was then called Cape Canaveral, briefed in this top picture, which I know you can't see very well. The buildings weren't built then. So he had the models of what was going to be done. And the NASA number 3, who had gone to Harvard with Kennedy, Bob Siemens, said maybe this is the first time he realized just how big a thing this was, and got very enthusiastic. And then he went out to a launch pad where a Saturn I rocket, relatively small but bigger than anything that had been launched before, was sitting ready for launch, and briefed by Wernher von Braun. I really wish I had audio to go along with this video clip. You'll see why I do the video. In fact, let's try it. You can see what a charismatic and handsome person von Braun was, by the way, as was Kennedy. There's my book cover, which is why I use this. He went back that day to his father's home in Palm Beach, next door to Trump's place, and 6 days later was dead. It's not clear what would have happened. What might have Kennedy done? Would he have backed off the goal? I think not. Some suggest maybe yes. Would he have relaxed the end of the decade deadline? Maybe. There was some pressure to do that. Would he have continued to push for cooperation? I think almost certainly yes, but staying the course. This speech I'm now going to run is my favorite Kennedy space speech. And I have to, again, for the participants, and for the local people. He quotes an Irish writer, Frank O'Connor, who I just discovered is from Cork. And you folks, your lecture hall is the Frank O'Connor Lecture Hall. So here's Kennedy.
We have a long way to go, many weeks and months and years of long, tedious work lies ahead. There will be setbacks and frustrations and disappointments. There will be, as there always are, pressures on this country to do less in this area as in so many others, and temptations to do something else that's perhaps easier. But this research here must go on. This space effort must go on. The conquest of space must and will go ahead. That much we know. That much we can say with confidence and conviction. Frank O'Connor, the Irish writer, tells in one of his books how, as a boy, he and his friends would make their way across the countryside. And when they came to an orchard wall that seemed too high and too doubtful to try and too difficult to permit their voyage to continue, they took off their hats and tossed them over the wall, and then they had no choice but to follow them. This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it.
24 hours later, Kennedy was dead. What can you say about Kennedy in the race to the moon? He wasn't a visionary. He wasn't much concerned about space science. The image of a human future in space was not very central to his thinking. He was a politician, a pragmatic national leader who came to a judgment that the U.S. interest was being number one in space because of its contribution to national power, to national image. We can maybe in the Q&As, if we want to explore this, say, well, was that a good decision back then? Was it, looking back more than 50 years, the right thing to do? It was terribly expensive, $24 billion in the dollars of the time. And we did it. And I think those of us that lived through it, it was one of the most important things in their life. I had the privilege on July the 16th, 1969, at 9:32 a.m., watching people leave for the moon. And that's something you remember all your life. Then you have Nixon. Lyndon Johnson, worried about the war in Southeast Asia, his Great Society, social programs, kept Apollo going as a memorial to a fallen young president, but refused to approve anything to follow Apollo. So it was clear when Richard Nixon was elected president in the fall of 1968 and sworn in January the 20th, 1969. January 20th is Buzz Aldrin's birthday, for whatever that's worth. That he had to make the decisions on what to do after Apollo. We had in the United States the dramatic success in Christmas time of '68 of Apollo 8 orbiting the moon, reading the books of Genesis back to us here on Earth, bringing back the Earthrise picture of the beautiful blue Earth rising over the barren moon. It was clear that soon we would be walking on the moon. Nixon had views on this. He had been more bullish on space than President Eisenhower, and actually suggested the separate civilian agency that became NASA. Read this middle bullet. We must support a space program that's second to none, but the new president has to cut its budget. It's that ambivalence that characterized Nixon all the way through, and you'll see some of that. He hired on as NASA administrator a man that didn't share that ambivalence at all, a man named Tom Paine. He's in the middle in this picture. On the right is Vice President Spiro Agnew and Nixon. Paine was a visionary, fascinated by naval analogies. He had been a submarine officer during World War II, wanted a dramatic post-Apollo goal, a banner to be hoisted, and that, in his mind, was human missions to Mars. He talked about bands of brothers. NASA should be swashbuckling. Nixon didn't buy any of that. But it took him a while, not 3 weeks to make decisions, but 3 years. Nixon, the president, set up a group headed by Agnew to make recommendations on what to do after Apollo. It took about 5 months between March and September of '69 came in with recommendations that centered on Mars in the 80s as a reason to build a big space station and a space shuttle to service it in the 70s. Different programs. There was only one program at different paces. And I hope you can read this in the back. The recommendations, do I have a, yeah, by rights. This was the program that was recommended, Program 2, and it called for the initial Mars expedition in 1986. If we had gone as fast as we could go, von Braun said you could go to Mars in 1981. Before that, you'd build a space station, a 50-person space base, 100-man, this was the 70s, space base, lunar orbit stations, lunar base, and then off to Mars. And by the way, you need a transportation system, an Earth-to-orbit system at the time of the space station, something to shuttle back and forth to the station. That's where the shuttle came from. This recommendation was presented to Nixon. There's a picture of the presentation. And here's Nixon over there and Agnew here and the people on the group. The reaction was, are you kidding? We're not interested in spending that kind of money. We're not interested in making large and new investments in space. In fact, we're trying to balance the budget. So even though NASA in Apollo 11 in July, Apollo 12 in November of 1969 had done 2 very successful lunar missions, its budget got cut. And NASA was told, don't expect a lot of money while Richard Nixon was president. Here is Nixon talking about his views on space a couple years later, because he didn't put the tapes in until 1971. And listen to the 2 statements. You can read them because the tapes aren't very clear.
Once a nation gives up in the competition to explore the unknown, or once it accepts a position of inferiority, it ceases to be a great nation. What happened to Spain? It happened in the 20th century to the French, and later the British. And it could happen to the United States. And that's what it's all about. And so when you look at these various things, as to the space program and the rest, whether it's the moon, whether it's Mars, or whether it's a shuttle, or who knows what it is, I don't care what it is. The main thing is we gotta go. We gotta go till we gotta find out. And out of this you get it all.
So you listen to that and you say he should be an enthusiast for a strong space program. But a couple of weeks later,
The United States should not drop out of any competition in a breakthrough in knowledge and exploring the unknown. That's one of the reasons I support the space program. I don't give one damn about space. So I'm one of those space cadet types.
so take your pick of which Nixon. I mean, one of the things that we lived through Richard Nixon was that there wasn't one Nixon, there were multiple personalities. Nixon never gave a space speech. At the time of Apollo 11, he never mentioned John Kennedy. So the White House issued a statement in response to the Space Task Group report. And that statement I've called the Nixon Space Doctrine. I'm the one that has coined that phrase. Nobody did at the time. But I would argue this is the U.S. space policy since 1970. Think of it. Continuing process, not separate leaps. A regular, normal part of our life, competing for priority with all the other things. NASA hasn't done very well in that competition. First thing that happened was we decided not to produce any more Saturn V's. So gave up the capability to explore after spending billions of dollars to develop it. There were 15 Saturn V's built. Several of them are in museums. They're spectacular if you ever get a chance to see them. Remarkable machines. They almost always worked. But we threw them away. We're trying to rebuild it now. So the first thing was giving up the ability to explore in the future. Then we canceled 2 Apollo missions. We were supposed to go through Apollo 19, and the one that was numbered 15 and the one that was numbered 19 were canceled. 15 didn't have the rover vehicle, 19 did, so we were giving up a lot of capability, and renumbered the rest of them. So Apollo 17 ended up being the last scheduled mission to the moon. NASA was willing to give up the missions because they knew how risky they were, even before Apollo 13. How many of you folks from Cork have seen Apollo 13? A few. All right. So you know how risky that was. It scared the bejesus out of the NASA leadership because they knew how risky sending people to the moon right at the edge of the performance margin. So we decided to quit while we were ahead, basically. In fact, Nixon would like to have canceled 16 and 17. This is a kind of graphic demonstration of his attitude towards the moon program. Oop. Pushed the wrong thing. Trying to get that's what the laser is there. Oh. Here is the Earthrise Apollo 8 picture hanging in the Oval Office, December of 1969, so a year after the mission. Here's the same office a couple of years later, and you have a landscape painting. The moon had disappeared. And it's a good example of Nixon's attitude towards continuing lunar exploration. He did do some positive things relevant to Europe in particular. He was interested in expanded international cooperation, having non-U.S. people fly on U.S. spacecraft in particular, he called his pet project. You can see in 70, he said, let's get German, Japanese, British, no Irish, and French astronauts to participate. And that had results. Apollo-Soyuz, U.S.-Soviet docking in 1975, European and Canadian participation in the space shuttle program. You have in the audience back there Bob Thirsk, a Canadian astronaut who probably would not have gotten the chance to fly if Canada hadn't participated in the shuttle program. So a lot of benefits. By 1970, it was clear to NASA that it was not going to get approval for what it wanted to do, which was build a big space station. And so it was kind of pick one, space station or space shuttle. It didn't make sense to build a station without the logistics, supply, transportation system, but you could build the transportation system and use it for everything. And so NASA decided in 1970 to focus on getting approval to build the space shuttle without setting a goal for what the shuttle was supposed to do except be cheap and routine. They had to invent a rationale to be all things to all people. Then it took 2.5 years to figure out what shuttle to develop. Again, you have the image of the shuttle orbiter, which is the top vehicle here, which was about the size of an Airbus 330 or so. And the bottom was about the size of 747 or an Airbus 380. 13 engines in the rear of the bottom stage, which was just to get the thing going and fly back, be fully reusable. 2 years of study of how to do that, NASA ultimately decided it was too hard. The design of this, particularly 15 by 60 payload bay, a bus-size payload bay to carry cargo, and the delta wings that allow maneuvering on re-entry across a wide range so that you can get back to the same place you started from, were to meet DoD requirements. Particularly the payload bay was launching big photo reconnaissance spy satellites. These are some rather exotic missions that were thought about at the start of the shuttle program. Interception, inspection, and maybe even destroy. satellites if you didn't like them. So shuttle was, in fact, an anti-satellite weapon, at least in potential. And something could launch on demand, fly around the world once, and land in Washington so you can get the information to the president right away. That was not the shuttle we built, but those were the kind of ideas at the start of the program. NASA, in the middle of 1971, said the technical challenges of building both these things at the same time are too great, and we're not going to get the money to do it, so let's concentrate on just building the orbiter, the part that goes into space. And then we're kind of 6 months of really kind of craziness of everybody designing a system to do that. We had economists designing space shuttles, which is crazy. New head of NASA, Jim Fletcher, was sworn in April of 71. That's him with his hand raised, being sworn in. On the NASA side, on the administration, White House side, it was the budget people taking the lead and the science advisors office supporting the idea that the shuttle was not a good investment in what the United States was going to do. These were kind of upper middle level people. What they didn't know was that Nixon had already decided he wanted the shuttle. His, at that time, number 2 in our budget office, Office of Management and Budget, wrote this rather interesting memo, a man named Caspar Weinberger. And I'll read most of it because it's hard to see it from the back. Apollo flights have been successful from all points of view. They give the American people much needed lift in spirit, and the people of the world an equally needed look at American superiority. Not continuing human spaceflight, not approving the shuttle, would be confirming in some respects a belief I fear is gaining credence at home and abroad that our best years are behind us, that we're voluntarily giving up our great power status. This memo went from Nixon, from Weinberger to Nixon. Nixon made a lot of decisions by sitting at night in the White House, some music playing, perhaps a libation by his side. He liked to drink, and writing on things. And here, this handwriting is Nixon saying, I agree with Cap. I would say that the basic decision there would be a shuttle was made at that point, but there were 4 more months of argument about it. As the decision got close, here's Nixon talking to his top policy advisor. The first person you'll hear is a man named John Ehrlichman, who was the top policy advisor. And again, the point here is what Nixon thought approving the shuttle was about.
The Southern California people have a mighty press on for this space shuttle to be located in Southern California. And it's a highly visited kind of thing. Now, if we were to announce that the State of the Union at some time that you're going ahead with a space shuttle, that's a big statement. It's not very much out there. It gets to be big. I wouldn't even make it even a State of the Union thing.
Nixon.
Particularly interesting. I just put it out in California where you're going to put jobs, right, John? I don't think people get one down about a space shuttle. Well, they do in terms of jobs, and that's what I heard. So where the jobs are, it's California. Well, they're
that's national leadership and vision, right? I date NASA becoming a jobs program to these set of decisions on doing the shuttle. Nixon, by the way, at this point, this is November of 71, was worried about being reelected a year later and had to win California, he thought, to win re-election. So having jobs in California was very important to his political future. By December, it came down to a shuttle designed by the budget office, again, funny business, small, experimental, not launched very often, or the big shuttle that NASA wanted to build. And Nixon had said, "Well, let's do the smaller one." NASA complained about that. December of '71, lots of arguments. Finally, a decision to build the big one, which again, for those of you that are space types, look at the numbers of cost per mission for the big shuttle was $7.7 million a flight. It ended up being about 20 times more than that. Nixon wasn't involved, as far as I can tell, in these final decisions on what shuttle to build, but Fletcher had to go out to the Western White House in San Clemente, California for a photo op, and so the decision could be announced. The shuttle actually had a name at that point. It was going to become the Space Clipper. Nixon didn't like the name and said, let's just call it Shuttle. And Shuttle it's been. It's not a toy, he said. There's a fascinating memo for the record by the number 2 at NASA, George Lowe, recording this meeting. And then Nixon was said to say in a statement, again, he never said this, Shuttle will revolutionize transportation in space by routinizing it. It will take the astronomical costs out of astronautics. Well, didn't work that way. So I would say Kennedy's key decision was set a lunar landing before the decade is out as a national goal. Nixon, I think, made 3 decisions. First of all, to normalize the space program, make it part of the day in and day out things we had to do, not set another ambitious, dramatic goal, and continue human spaceflight, but do it in a system that can only go to low Earth orbit, where we have stayed until today, and will continue to stay in the indefinite future, maybe until 5 or 6 years from now. How do you evaluate that? Was it, doing something positive, approving a big new program, but not spending a lot of money? Was it a mistake to lower the priority of space? There wasn't much public interest in a big new program. Maybe it was a correct decision in democratic terms, reflecting public priorities. It was certainly not a leadership decision. But it's a decision that has lasted for 40 years. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Part of that decision was as soon as you got the shuttle flying, NASA was going to ask to build a space station. One of the other reasons this payload bay was designed the size it was with the weightlifting capability was to be able to launch modules of a space station. So it was absolutely predictable, and in fact people in 1971 and 72 predicted it. When the shuttle was declared ready to operate, which happened in 1982, NASA would then say, it's time to build a space station. And that's exactly what happened. So to me, the space station was part of the shuttle decision. And the 2 of them together have defined what the U.S. space human program, anyway, has been since. And the combination of flying the shuttle, building the space station, operating the space station, giving the declining budgets, really meant we couldn't do anything else in space. There was no money for exploration. 2 presidents, George H.W. Bush in 1989, George W. Bush in 2004, and for that matter, Barack Obama in 2010, had proposed missions of going beyond Earth orbit. The first 2 were stillborn, never happened. We'll still see what happens with Mr. Obama. So what is the Nixon space heritage? It's mixed. We're not going to have a program of exploration in the 20th century, but we're going to continue to fly humans. We're going to try to do it without adequate funding. We on the Columbia board investigating the accident of the Columbia shuttle said the program has been trying to do too much with too little for too long. Only stay in Earth orbit, and foreign participation will be a hallmark, first on the shuttle and then on the space station. So it's a mixed record. Where are we now? Almost done. It seems to me that Kennedy's decision formed the image of what the space program is supposed to be about. Dramatic, going places, exciting, pushing frontiers. But we stopped that program in 1970, or 72 if you want, with Apollo 17. I don't think I said as I went through it. Nixon issued a statement as Apollo 17 left the moon in December of 72 saying this is the last time people will walk on the moon in this century. He said that 38 years before the turn of the century, and he was right. We haven't been back. It's Nixon's decisions that have shaped the program, and so I come to the conclusion, it's kind of contrary to public general understanding, that Richard Nixon had more influence on the U.S. space program than John Kennedy, and I hope I've convinced you of that. Now, where are we? We're waiting is where we are. We have a new president, talks about space as part of making America great again, has established now a White House body to manage the U.S. space program. The current program is supposed to send us to Mars about 20 to 25 years from now, with maybe humans orbiting Mars as early as 2033. We'll see. Will someone plant a flag on the surface of Mars? I found an image today with a flag without an identifiable nation on it. So the question is, what flag will that be? Will it be a United Nations flag? Will it be a U.S. flag, European flag, Chinese flag, some coalition flag? We'll see. Will we have a leader who speaks for the future the way Kennedy did September the 12th, 1962, talking about Apollo?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
We'll see. Thank you. Now, I have something to say just to the participants. You know that for you there's a reception afterwards. And I think you also know that I have a very limited number of these two books, one to a customer, not two, that I can provide you at the current those prices and be happy to sign for you. And if we run out, we'll make arrangements to get more. So. Floor is open for questions or rebuttal.
Yes, thanks, John. So yeah, we'll have time for some questions. If you have questions, please raise your arm and somebody will come to you with a microphone.
Hi. Yeah, it'll work better if it's on.
Hello.
Yeah, there it's good.
Hi. So I was just curious in terms of after Kennedy and after Nixon.
Could you stand up and talk a little louder?
Sorry. So I'm just curious as to your opinions on after Kennedy and after Nixon. Why do you feel that American space policy has essentially been going downhill since then in terms of not capturing the imagination of the public in terms of going to the moon, going to Mars?
It's a tough answer for this crowd. You're all here probably because you like space, are excited by it. Unfortunately, you're in the minority. What's happened to the U.S. space program rather accurately reflects the lack of public support for a major new effort. As I said, 2 presidents, George H.W. Bush, George Bush, said back to the moon. The father said this time to stay. And the reaction was kind of a yawn. No public excitement, none, and no political momentum to fund the programs. So we have been about at the same budget level or gradually declining level for 40 years. That's why I say the decisions that Nixon made really have stuck. And those of us that have lived through the excitement would love to see it again. So it's your generation that's going to do it. So.
Another question?
Yeah. Mike.
Yes, I really enjoyed the subject, and
Thank
I
you.
enjoy history, and I like geopolitical things as well. And I have a question for you, sir. In the 1960s, the U.S. was a creditor nation, which means that there was more money coming in than going out. And by the end of the 60s, you mentioned that there was the Apollo moon race. Then you mentioned there was something, the Great Society, heard you earlier in a class. And of course, there was the Vietnam War. Those are 3 major bleedings that took place in the Treasury. So my question is, Nixon did cut the space program, but also in the early 70s, the U.S. Abandoned the gold standard called the Nixon shock. And so that was, just to plug a hole, I think, that was a major factor in the U.S. backtracking, because they were now moving into being a debtor nation and not a creditor nation. And what's your thoughts on that, please?
Well, space is the most discretionary of discretionary funding, or at least space exploration. We don't have to do it. You know, the Stephen Hawkings of the world, or Elon Musk, would say, in order to avoid human extinction, we have to go settle someplace else. But let's set that aside. You know, going to the moon, going to Mars, are things that society, if it decides to do it, it's because it wants to, not because it has to. And in a tough economic situation, and the economy, it's been always tough, there really, again, I go back to what Nixon said, this has to compete with other uses of money. And in that competition, it hadn't done very well. Let's hope there's enough momentum in the current program to go resume exploration, to sustain it. We're not going to do an Apollo-like thing again. You know, it's nice to play the Kennedy speech at the end, but that's not going to happen again. If we're going to go to Mars, we should do it internationally, and we should do it step by step, more or less on the basis of affordability. And crafting the program to do that is proven to be elusive.
Any other questions?
Hello, thank you for your talk. So we hear today in class that the government investment in space, and specifically in NASA, is just less and less in every year. So in your opinion, how was space program of USA going to look like in 20 years from now?
Well, that's a good question. I will answer it. But tomorrow's lecture for you all is aimed at answering that. It will certainly have more involvement by the private sector. Will be a mixture of government and private sector initiatives. 20 years from now, 1937, we should be close to landing on, well, wait a minute. We'll be back on the moon. You bank that prediction that we will return to the moon in the next 20 years. And we should be, and I hope we will be, close to being on our way to Mars. I think there's enough support behind the current program to keep it going. I hope I'm right. So there will be human exploration. There will be few humans living for long durations on the moon and getting ready to set foot on Mars, 2037. Yeah. You'll be there. In fact, you're the folks that are going to make it happen. I said that before. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. I was just wondering, do you not think commercial space agencies are making like a new space race almost, sort of today?
You're talking Irish. Say it slower.
Oh, sorry, I'm not Irish. Thank you for your lecture.
Yeah.
I was just wondering...
Oh, that part I heard.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on whether the commercial space industries are sort of creating a new space race of today, really.
Is there a new space race? Are you a runner? Don't races have finish lines? I mean, a race means a competition to get someplace first, right? Is there a new space race to get to Mars? No. Is there going to be intense competition for the payoffs from space? Yes. I don't call that a race. I call that a competition. So, there are visionaries, entrepreneurs who see in the space sector all kinds of business opportunities, commercial opportunities. Plus, there are the people who want to be in space, hope they can figure out how to make money, that'll do it anyway, just because they are, to use the cliche, a space cadet. They want to be involved. Jeff Bezos, head of Amazon, 4th richest person in the world, I think. Elon Musk is wealthy. Jeff Bezos is rich. He sells $1 billion of stock every year of Amazon stock to finance his space company. That's rich. He was the valedictorian, the key speaker in his high school class, and said, I want to go to space, as an 18-year-old. Now he's doing it as a 50-some-year-old. There are people like that are committed to expanding the frontier. And again, I keep saying, maybe some of them are sitting here. I know they'd like to be.
Have we time for one last question?
There's one up in the low-price seats.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your lecture, and welcome to Cork. My question is a little bit off topic. It's just something I've wondered about all my life. Do you think if Gus Grissom hadn't been killed, might he have been the first guy to walk on the moon?
Let me see if I understood the question. If Kennedy had not been killed, would we have gone to the moon? Kept going?
No, Gus Grissom.
Go further. Huh? Oh, what about Gus Grissom?
No. If he hadn't been killed.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, nothing with Kennedy, Grissom. What's remarkable is that the Apollo 1 fire, and it wasn't just Grissom, it was Roger Chaffee and Ed White. There are 3 people killed in that accident. One thing is likely is if Grissom had not been killed, he would have been the first person on the moon. He was in line for the command of the first landing mission. It really did not cause a debate. It was viewed as some bad thing that happened on the way to the moon, not a tragedy that called into question going to the moon. So my answer is, if Grissom, that unfortunate accident really didn't have much to do with finishing the program, my view. But I've looked at that pretty carefully, so I think it's correct. Do we have a positive last question so we don't have to talk about people getting killed? If not, thank you all.
Thank you very much, John. So on behalf of the International Space University, we have a small gift for you for having the time with us this evening.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
you know,